Police in Spain still on the hunt for the driver in Thursday's terror attack in Barcelona. Joining me now with a reaction to the latest news and what it means for us here at home, former CIA counterterrorism officer Buck Sexton and a former Department of Homeland Security consultant, Mustafa Tameez. Thank you both for being with us here tonight.
Thank you.
Buck, I want to start with you. So this attack in Spain marks the sixth kind where we've seen a vehicle used in a European nation to cause mass casualties. Is this the new normal in Europe?
Well, what's interesting in this case is that it seemed that they were actually trying to build what we would call VBIEDs, vehicle-borne improvised explosive devices, based on the bomb factory that went up and that actually was really, in some ways, the reason for the accelerated attack planning. This was a plan B for them, using the vehicles. Plan A was to use TATP, based on Spanish language reports, which is a homemade explosive that, by the way, is a hallmark of the Islamic State's previous either inspired or directed terrorist attacks in cities like Brussels, in Manchester, in Paris. So there have been a number of high-profile attacks using this explosive, but it is difficult to handle, and if you make a mistake, it can be your last, and that's why the house went up and they decided to go to vehicles instead. So this is a combination of different terror tactics that we've seen in the past, and quite honestly, Lisa, it actually could have been much worse than it was.
Well, we also know that ISIS has been pushing out propaganda, encouraging people to use vehicles for these kinds of attacks, sadly. Mustafa, I want to get to you, and I have a question for you. You know, the CIA has repeatedly or reportedly warned Spanish officials about an attack like this. Do you have any information on that, or can you tell our viewers a little bit more about that?
Well, there was a number of chatter about that there may be potentially attack in this. You know, the Spain has been somewhat fortunate in that there was a terror plot that was thwarted earlier. There was a lot of intelligence that something could happen there, but so far nothing had occurred. We've seen a lot of activity coming because of North Africa. But, you know, here's the reality that we're all facing. ISIS has put out a call for people to, you know, act where they are, and that's been a very dangerous. We're seeing radical extremism, you know, for people to you know, take these homemade devices like cars and just ram them into people. So this is what's dangerous. What Buck is talking about, now taking it to the next level. Just imagine if they were able to take this. You know, these propane tanks, and we're able to take them into a populated tourist area, it would have been far, far, far worse.
And Mustafa, I also want to ask you just more broadly on ISIS. So we've seen President Trump ask for a comprehensive plan from Secretary Mattis, something that General Jack Keane has said President Obama never did. We've seen some gains in ISIS or in Syria and Iraq against ISIS as well. How do you think President Trump is doing in his fight against ISIS?
Look, I think we're making tremendous gains on the ground in Syria and Iraq. What we have to really do, and what we haven't done, is how do we fight the battle of the ideas. We're not doing enough in countering violent extremism on the net. We're not taking down enough websites. We're not taking down enough Twitter accounts. We've gotten more cooperation than we ever have on social media, but still to this day, we haven't put together a comprehensive strategy to take down these websites and take down the YouTube videos. Anwar al-Awlaki, who we took down with a drone attack years and years ago, his videos to this day are still being used to radicalize youth, not just in Europe, but even within the United States. And we have to do a much better job to do that today.
But Buck, is taking down these websites, is that enough to combat this ideology? Because we've seen all these groups, whether it's the Taliban, whether it's Al-Qaeda, whether it's ISIS, and they keep sprouting up, and they all share the same ideology. So is it simply just taking down these websites, is that enough? No,
it's not enough, and this is a challenge that we've been trying to deal with on the counter-radicalization side for the entirety of the post-9/11 era. We're still finding out a fair amount about these young men, a dozen or so of them, in a very large and complex terror cell. But at this point, some of the markers that you would expect for radicalization, some of the social media and other electronic signatures that you would think you'd see for somebody who had gone through a jihadization process, it's not there. These individuals, some of them are very young. They were considered to be among peers, well integrated, very westernized, and they weren't, as we've seen in some other attacks, by and large, well known to authorities as extremists. They weren't being watched because it was thought maybe they had returned from training with the Islamic State. So counter-radicalization in this case may involve a preacher, that's been reported, somebody who is a visiting preacher. And so you're going to have to try and stop that from happening, which is a very tall order. And quite honestly, up until this point, I think Spain and some of these European countries have done a pretty good job disrupting plots. But the problem is when one gets through, you have a mass casualty event like this. And there's a lot of other issues that you can bring into the discussion that I think should happen. Immigration policy is one of them. But counter-radicalization is something that we're going to continue to struggle with, not just for years, but for decades.
Right. And Mustafa, real quick, you had mentioned North Africa. How big is ISIS's footprint right now across the world?
Well, we can begin to really take them down and shrink the ground in North Africa. I don't think we've done enough, but we can do more. But the global challenge is that we can't shrink their footprint on the internet, and that's what I was talking about, that we've got to find a much better way to shrink their footprint on the internet, because these communities on the internet begin to grow very rapidly. Someone on a laptop can do that. The other thing I want to talk about just briefly is that we've seen a lot of radicalization in prisons across Europe. We've seen these petty criminals that go in for very minor crimes in Europe and come out hardened, not just criminals, but hardened terrorists. And we have to do a much better job in working through prisons in Europe that we haven't done. We've seen a number of hardened terrorists come out of prisons in Europe that I think it's a growing phenomenon.
Well, Mustafa, Buck, thank you so much for your expertise. We really appreciate it tonight.